Tonight, we're heading into the life of a cowboy, the real kind. No movie stunts or shiny boots here. Just grit, superstition, bad coffee, loud campfires, and gear held together with leather and luck. We'll dig into what they did for fun, how they stayed alive, what they believed in, and what they ate when no one was looking. So, grab a warm drink, lean back, and let's ride into the wild side of cowboy life. Raw, restless, and full of stories you won't hear in a history book. Picture this. A dusty saloon door swinging open so hard it almost flies off its hinges. The air inside smells like cheap whiskey, old leather, and wood that has soaked up a century of spilled drinks and spilled secrets. A piano clinks out of tune in the corner, and a cowboy, hat tilted just so, leans back in his chair, boot heels hooked on the edge of the table. He's telling a story so wild it sounds like he stole it from the wind itself. Out here, free time meant everything and nothing. Time blurred when there was no boss clocking your hours, just the sun rising and sinking behind the distant hills. Cowboys would gather around in smoky rooms, eyes squinting through the haze, playing endless rounds of poker. Chips clinked, cards slapped the table, and tempers flared faster than prairie fires. The stakes? Well, those could range from a week's wages to a prize saddle. You'd think they'd take it easy, but losing your horse gear could mean riding bareback for weeks. Imagine the bragging rights or the shame tied up in a single game. And if poker wasn't enough to stir the blood, there was always music. Someone would whip out a fiddle or a harmonica, and before long, boots stomped in a rough rhythm on the splintered floorboards. Maybe someone tried to sing, usually off-key but with all their heart. Songs drifted out into the dusty streets, curling up to the stars above. Sometimes, they'd turn into a rowdy dance, with tables shoved aside and a few cowboys spinning each other around until they collapsed, dizzy and laughing. You can almost hear the shouts echo off the wooden walls. A wild, reckless chorus under the moonlight. They craved stories, too, the kind of tall tales that grew taller with each retelling. Ghost herds seen in the moonlight, phantom riders that saved a man from a stampede, or the time someone allegedly outran a tornado on a half-broken Mustang. Everyone knew these stories were about as real as gold coins in a gambler's pocket. Shining for a second, gone the next, but that was the whole point. Cowboys loved to outdo each other in storytelling, leaning forward on their elbows, eyes glinting with mischief. When they weren't trying to outbluff each other at cards or outsing each other around the fire, they turned to the racetrack. Well, makeshift racetracks, usually a straight stretch of dusty road or a cleared patch in the middle of nowhere. Betting on horse races was almost sacred. They bet everything. Money, saddles, knives, even a lucky bandana that had supposedly saved someone from a bar fight. Riders crouched low over their horses, hair flying, the world melting into a blur of hooves and hoarse shouts. There was no official finish line, just a cluster of men yelling and squinting through the dust cloud, deciding by sheer gut feeling who had won. In town, it wasn't unusual to hear that a few cowboys had decided to ride the town, meaning they literally galloped their horses through the main street, shooting at signs and occasionally tossing bottles at each other. It was part protest, part celebration, part drunken dare, and all chaos. Shopkeepers would duck behind counters, mothers would drag their kids indoors, and the sheriff? He might watch from a window, shaking his head, knowing tomorrow he'd have to patch up bullet holes and chase down unpaid bar tabs. Imagine that. But for cowboys, this kind of wild chaos was a relief valve. They spent months on the trail, half-starved, sunburned, and saddle-sore, their world reduced to dust clouds and cattle horns. So when they hit town, they let loose with a vengeance. Cards, music, races, bar fights. All of it felt like gulping cold water after a long ride in the desert. They didn't just want entertainment. They needed it to remember they were still alive, still wild, still a little dangerous. Sometimes, if the saloon had a piano, a cowboy might sit down and plunk out a tune, surprising everyone. Maybe even himself. A hush would spread, broken only by the clink of a glass or a low whistle of appreciation. For a moment, the room would soften, the edges blur, and you'd see the tired boy hidden under the battered hat and calloused hands. Then, of course, someone would holler for another round, a chair would break, and the chaos would tumble right back in like a drunk old friend. That's how they liked it, rough, unpredictable, and always on the edge of going too far. Outside the saloon, under that enormous open sky, cowboys found even stranger ways to pass the long, restless hours. They'd organize duels between tarantulas and scorpions, betting whiskey shots and tobacco rolls on which tiny gladiator would survive. A circle scratched in the dirt served as their deadly arena. Hats leaned low, squinting eyes followed every twitch of those hairy legs and stinging tails. A roar would go up when one victor finally limped away. The loser flicked into the weeds with a boot tip. Strange? Maybe. But after weeks of dust, bad coffee, and the endless shuffle of hooves, this was the sort of entertainment that made them feel alive. When twilight slipped across the prairie, cowboys gathered around a flickering campfire, their shadows dancing like restless ghosts on the canvas of night. If someone had a guitar battered, missing a string or two, it would appear from a bedroll like a hidden treasure. A few shy chords, a low humming voice, and suddenly the whole camp seemed to exhale. Some men carved little wooden animals or notched their initials into scraps of leather. Others sat completely still, eyes distant, drifting somewhere between memory and dream. Maybe they thought about a girl back home, a green field far away, or a mother's kitchen that smelled like fresh bread and warm soup. Underneath all the roughness, there was always that ache, a homesickness as big as the prairie sky. Then someone would tell a story, wild ones, about ghost riders in the storm, or a friend who allegedly lassoed a mountain lion single-handed. Lies? Definitely, but no one cared. Every new exaggeration sparked a round of laughter, jeers, or impressed whistles. A good story was as valuable as a strong horse, and the best storytellers were treated like royalty, even if just for a few hours. Foot races were another favorite pastime, especially when the moon turned the world silver and cool. They'd line up barefoot on the hard-packed dirt, muscles coiled like springs, and sprint into the darkness with wild whoops trailing behind them. The winner earned bragging rights, a drink of whiskey, or maybe a slice of someone's precious jerky. You can almost hear their laughter ringing across the empty plains, echoing off invisible walls of night. Then there were trick roping contests. Cowboys challenged each other to rope anything that moved. A galloping horse, a dog, even another cowboy's hat. The lariats cracked and snapped, whirling in wide, confident arcs. A successful catch sent the crowd into a frenzy, a mixture of cheers and curses. Sometimes, a bold soul would stand on his horse, arms stretched like a circus performer, balancing while swinging the rope above his head. It wasn't about showing off for the crowd, though they loved an audience. It was about proving to themselves they still had control over at least one thing in this wild world. When they grew tired of games, they'd stage small rodeos right there on the prairie. A wild bronc, muscles twitching under its hide, would explode out of a makeshift pen, bucking like a demon set free. The rider clung on, hat flying, teeth gritted, eyes locked somewhere far away beyond the horizon. Every second felt like an eternity, each jolt rattling bones and testing guts. Afterwards, whether they landed in the dirt or somehow stayed on, they'd limp back to the fire, faces dusty but split wide with grins. Bruises and scrapes became badges of honor, each scar a silent story shared among brothers of the range. None of this was just about killing time. It was survival of the spirit. They needed laughter and bruises as much as water or bread. Out there, where the stars stretched forever and the wind never stopped talking, these small, chaotic joys were the heartbeat of cowboy life. They weren't just passing evenings. They were reminding each other they were still human, still wild, still free. Tomorrow they'd saddle up before dawn, chasing stray cattle into endless sunrise. But tonight, under the shimmering canopy of stars, they ruled a kingdom of dust, firelight, and reckless laughter. Sometimes, the town would host a real dance, an actual barn dance or a gathering in some dusty hall with creaky floors and lanterns hung low from the rafters. Cowboys would shuffle in, hair slicked back with borrowed pomade, shirts cleaner than usual, though never spotless, boots polished as best they could manage. Some would even swipe a flower from the roadside and tuck it behind an ear or into a vest pocket. A fiddler and maybe a banjo player set up in the corner, their music slicing through the thick air like a warm knife. It wasn't long before the place turned into a swirl of boots, skirts, and loud, unstoppable laughter. Most of these fellas hadn't touched a woman in months. Their hands, used to roping steers and throwing saddles, now fumbled awkwardly at a partner's waist. Yet, when the music took over, all that clumsiness faded. Feet moved almost on their own, and eyes shone with something soft and far away. Every spin and stomp was a reminder that under all the trail dust, they still had hearts beating strong, and that somewhere deep down, they remembered what it felt like to be gentle. Of course, fights would break out as they always did. Maybe someone cut in too many times, or a boot heel crunched on the wrong set of toes. Suddenly fists would fly, chairs would topple, and bottles might smash against the walls. But after a few minutes, someone would shout, "Play us another!" And just like that, the scuffle would fade into another dance, like a sudden summer storm clearing to reveal a bright sky. No grudges lasted long. Life was too short and too hard to stay mad over a busted lip or a stolen waltz. Other nights, far away from any town lights, a cowboy might wander off alone under the starlit dome. He might lie back on a grassy knoll, hat tipped over his eyes, listening to the wind murmur across the plains like an old friend telling secrets. Out there, the world felt big enough to swallow all his worries, and small enough to hold in one calloused hand. He might hum an old song his mother used to sing, or trace shapes in the constellations, imagining them as bucking broncos, running cattle, or long-lost sweethearts waving from another galaxy. It was in these quiet moments that a cowboy's mind could drift, away from the hard edges of work and the roar of saloon nights, into softer corners of memory and wonder. Sometimes a couple of cowboys would stay up together by the coals, sharing a plug of tobacco or passing a dented flask. They'd trade confessions they'd never say in daylight, fears about old wounds that wouldn't heal, dreams of starting a small ranch with real fences and a porch, or worries about a letter that never came. In the glow of dying embers, words came easier. By morning, these secrets drifted away like smoke, unspoken again, carried off by the breeze. The laughter, the brawls, the music, and even the stargazing. They were all vital sparks in a life that was otherwise ruled by dust and danger. When the sun rose the next day, they'd swing into the saddle with the same grit, the same jokes, and maybe a new bruise or two to brag about. Because no matter how wild the night got, they knew dawn would always come calling, and the trail never waited for a hangover or a broken heart. Somewhere deep inside each cowboy was a yearning for these wild releases, these short-lived freedoms that only a dance floor or a fistfight could offer. Underneath the hats and spurs lived boys who once played marbles in a dusty yard, who once dared each other to climb the tallest tree, and who now dared each other to ride the meanest bronco or win the prettiest girl's hand for one stolen dance. That boyish spirit never truly vanished. It just learned to wear chaps and spit into the wind. So if you ever hear about cowboys and their so-called reckless ways, remember, every reckless moment was a bright spark against the endless, shadowy plains. It wasn't just mischief. It was proof of life, proof that beneath the tough hides and squinted eyes, they still dreamed, laughed, and hurt just like anyone else. And maybe, just maybe, they needed those chaotic nights more than they ever let on. It was easy to think that cowboys were just rough men on rough horses, but their ways of finding joy showed something else. A stubborn softness hidden beneath layers of dust and sunburn. Sometimes that softness leaked out in unexpected ways. You might catch a cowboy sitting on a fence rail at sunrise, sketching shapes in the dirt with a boot heel, or find him braiding a scrap of rawhide into a little bracelet he'd never dare wear in front of the others. One might even write a line or two of a poem in a tattered notebook, only to crumple the page up and toss it into the fire before anyone noticed. They were always at war with that quiet, secret part of themselves. The part that missed home, missed touch, missed something they couldn't even name. The endless days on the trail turned time into a blur. Mornings started before the sun even thought about rising, the stars still sharp and bright overhead. The world felt like a secret in those hours. All hushed, the air crisp enough to sting your nose, and the sky a deep indigo. Coffee boiled in a battered pot, thick as tar and twice as bitter, waking the men with each scorching sip. They'd saddle up, their breath fogging in the cold air, and push the cattle forward with hoots and whistles echoing into the vast nothingness. But it was the evenings that truly belonged to them. After the cattle settled and the horses were tied off, that magic hour slipped in. Firelight flickered, faces glowed with the warmth of shared stories and cheap whiskey. A man might lean back on his saddle, hat tipped over his eyes, listening to the crackle of logs and the soft shuffle of boots moving around the circle. Sometimes someone would pull out a harmonica, the notes floating up into the starlit sky like quiet prayers. That harmonica might squeal and wheeze, but no one cared. It was a sound that made even the loneliest cowboy feel like he belonged to something bigger than himself. A favorite game on those nights was lie swapping. One cowboy would claim he'd once roped a coyote blindfolded, and another would jump in saying he had taught his horse to read trail signs and count poker chips. The more outrageous the tale, the louder the laughter. By the end, no one could tell what was real and what was pure wind, but that hardly mattered. The point wasn't to convince. The point was to forget the sore muscles, the blisters, and the ghost of loneliness that always trailed close behind. Even when they wandered into town, that same spirit followed. Some men went straight to the saloon, eager for cards and company. Others drifted into a small shop or sat on a stoop, just watching people go by. For a cowboy, seeing a bustling town was like visiting another world. All those folks in proper hats and shiny shoes, bustling around as if time itself could be tamed. But even there, he'd find ways to carve out a little joy. A stolen slice of pie from a kitchen window, a wink from a girl sweeping her porch, or a whittled toy traded to a wide-eyed kid for a peppermint stick. These small, human moments felt as precious as gold nuggets. And always, the horses waited outside, heads low, tails flicking at flies, patient as old monks. They knew that sooner or later, the cowboys would come stumbling back out, boots scuffed and spirits high, ready to ride again into the unknown. In the saddle, under that wide open sky, cowboys felt the purest kind of freedom, but freedom isn't always a peaceful thing. It's wild and restless, as likely to buck you off as carry you across a river. They accepted this bargain without complaint, leaning into every sharp turn and sudden jolt, because each day held the promise of a new story, a new scar, a new laugh by the fire. So when you think of a cowboy galloping over a ridge, hair whipping in the wind, remember that he's not just chasing cattle. He's chasing a feeling, that heady rush of being alive, of being unpinned and unclaimed by any fence or rule. His laughter in the dark, his voice cracking over an old song, his quiet stargazing. All of it is part of the same restless heart, a heart that beats to the rhythm of hoofbeats and campfire songs, forever caught somewhere between the dust and the stars. Even in the deepest stretches of night, when the stars looked close enough to pluck from the sky, there was a pulse running through the camp. A few cowboys might stay up to guard the herd, leaning against their saddles, eyes half-lidded but ears sharp as coyotes. Out there, silence wasn't really silent. The grass whispered under the breeze, distant hoofs shifted, and an occasional snort or low bellow reminded them that 1,000 restless souls stood just beyond the shadows. Sometimes, one would softly hum an old hymn or an outlaw ballad, the words drifting off before they ever reached the chorus. Another might toss a pebble at his friend's hat, a small rebellion against the heavy quiet. Those late-night watchers carried an unspoken understanding. The darkness was as much a part of them as the saddle or the rope. They might fear it, respect it, curse it, but they belonged to it all the same. At dawn, when the first thin line of light cracked open the eastern horizon, they were already moving. Coffee boiled again, black as sin and strong enough to stand a spoon upright. A few smudged tin cups clinked, passed around like holy relics. Someone might slap another on the back hard enough to rattle teeth. Half greeting, half wake-up call. They threw their gear together in seconds, swung into saddles with practiced grace, and turned to face a new day full of dust, cattle bawling, and the unpredictable moods of the prairie. Days rolled into each other like a stack of worn playing cards. Sometimes they found water and soft grass, and the cattle grazed contentedly under a sky so wide it felt endless. Other times, storms rolled in heavy and mean, the wind slashing at faces, rain hitting like tiny knives. Lightning cracked the dark like a whip, and thunder seemed to rumble straight up from the bones of the earth. During those tempests, men would curse the heavens, laugh into the wind, or just hunch forward and ride through it, because stopping wasn't an option. They might arrive at camp soaked to the skin, mud streaking their faces, looking like ghosts clawed out of the ground. But by the fire, steam rose from their coats, laughter sparked again, and someone always found a joke buried under the misery. Those who only saw cowboys as rowdy bar brawlers or dusty silhouettes on a horizon missed the real marrow of the life. It wasn't just brawls and bronco busting. It was quiet acts of loyalty, the gift of a dry blanket on a freezing night, a shared biscuit when supplies ran low. It was risking a busted rib to pull a friend out of a stampede, or riding all night to fetch help for a man thrown from his horse. Their bonds were forged in sweat, blood, and the kind of laughter that echoes long after the fire dies down. Sometimes, in the hush before sleep took over, a cowboy would whisper secrets to the night sky, lost love letters that never got sent, apologies that never found ears, dreams of a cabin by a creek with chickens and a dog. The prairie listened, always patient, always silent. It swallowed every confession, kept every wish safe beneath its endless stars. By the time their heads finally hit a saddle or a folded blanket, sleep came fast and heavy. Dreams were often wild and jumbled. Runaway cattle morphing into stampeding ghosts, sweethearts standing by moonlit fences, and old friends laughing from beyond some far-off ridge. When morning came, they'd shake those dreams off like dust, boots hitting the ground before the sun fully understood its own warmth. Through it all, they carried on with a sort of quiet pride. Not the loud, chest-thumping kind, but a pride worn like an old vest, patched, faded, but always there. They took pride in a clean rope throw, a horse kept calm in a storm, a friend's life saved by quick thinking. They never said much about it. Words felt too flimsy to hold something so big. Better to show it in the small things. A steady hand, a nod across the fire, a rough laugh shared under a moon that looked like a silver coin dropped in a deep well. When the final sparks of the campfire drifted into the night and the prairie hummed its ancient, lonely tune, those cowboys knew. They weren't just living from sunup to sundown. They were stringing together tiny lights in the dark, sparks of life that refused to be snuffed out, no matter how long the trail or how loud the wind. As the last campfire stories dissolved into the starry night and the cowboys drifted into heavy sleep, there was another side to their lives waiting beyond the songs and laughter, the side carved into their bones by endless days under the sun and long, grinding work. Because for all the dancing and trick roping, it was the daily grind that shaped them most deeply, turning each man into a tough, stubborn piece of living folklore. Before dawn's first pale stretch across the prairie, they were already up, shaking the cold out of their joints and pulling saddles tight by moonlight. It wasn't glamorous. Buckles creaked, and rawhide straps bit into sore shoulders. They packed everything with a quiet efficiency that came only from repetition. A misplaced rope or a twisted cinch could mean a day of cursing and lost cattle, and nobody wanted that kind of headache. On the trail, the work wasn't just hard. It was constant. Every day blurred into a dance of herding stubborn cows, patching up gear, and keeping horses calm in every kind of weather. The cowboys guided the herd over rough ground, across dry creek beds that cracked like old pottery, and up slopes that seemed determined to throw both man and beast right back down. Sometimes they rode for hours in silence, except for the occasional low whistle or the soft cluck of a tongue urging a horse forward. In those moments, the only music was the creak of leather, the rhythmic chomp of a horse's bit, and the sighing wind. A cowboy's body paid the price for every mile. Saddle sores burned like fire, and legs cramped after long stretches without rest. Hands grew as tough as old boots, fingers permanently curled from gripping reins and ropes. Sunburn turned skin into cracked leather, and dust seemed to live permanently beneath fingernails and along every wrinkle. After a while, a cowboy's face became a map, each crease marking a squint at a far-off ridge or a long day in the punishing wind. Gear was their lifeline, and every piece had its story. A well-worn saddle might bear scars from a bronco that refused to be tamed, or a bridle patched with rawhide in a midnight emergency. Spurs jingled low and lazy, sounding almost like a private laugh in the stillness. A hat wasn't just shade. It was a shield against rain, a pillow on the ground, or a makeshift bucket when water ran low. Each bandana carried sweat, blood, and more than a few whispered curses. Those small items were more than tools. They were pieces of a cowboy's soul stitched into leather and cloth. The horses, too, were not just animals but partners in the great dusty waltz. A good horse could read a cowboy's thoughts almost before they were formed, shifting weight, turning sharply, or easing forward at the slightest nudge. Cowboys learned to trust their mounts more than most people. In the dark or in a sudden stampede, that silent understanding often meant the difference between life and a lonely grave marked only by hoofprints. When they weren't driving the herd or chasing strays, cowboys were mending fences or scouting the horizon for trouble. Rustlers, predators, or storms rolling in like a fist. They carried rifles not just for show but as a daily insurance policy against coyotes, wolves, or worse yet, two-legged threats who might fancy a cow or a horse that didn't belong to them. Even the simplest tasks, boiling coffee, patching a torn coat, tightening a loose shoe on a horse, demanded focus and grit. Each moment out there was a reminder. Nature doesn't hand out second chances. And yet, through all this, they carried a strange kind of calm. It wasn't the quiet of a man at rest, but a calm forged from knowing that every day could bring a new challenge, a new scar, and maybe even a new story to tell around the next campfire. There was no easy path, no days off, no good enough. Just the slow, stubborn march forward, one hoofbeat and one boot step at a time. So when you picture a cowboy kicking back at a saloon or hollering at a dance, remember the other side of that coin. The endless sun, the frozen mornings, the blood on their knuckles, and the silent talks with their horses under an empty sky. That was their real life, stitched together with dust and sweat, and held upright by nothing but pure, unbreakable will. All that grit and labor carved cowboys into living legends, even if they never saw themselves that way. To them, it was simply the price of the horizon. A horizon that always seemed to dance just out of reach, promising something new over every ridge. Days on the trail felt endless, but no two were exactly the same. Some mornings started with a hush, the air so still you could hear a horse chew from 20 paces away. Other days roared to life with a sudden stampede, cattle surging like a living river across the plain, hoofs thundering so loud they rattled your bones. When that happened, cowboys didn't have time to think, only to react. Racing forward, swinging ropes, yelling into the dust storm that swallowed man and beast alike. They'd return hours later, lungs burning, faces black with grit, eyes shining with that wild glint only danger can spark. On calmer days, there was time to notice the small wonders that hid in plain sight. A hawk wheeling overhead, the flicker of a jackrabbit disappearing into a sage bush, or the slow, mesmerizing dance of heat waves on the horizon. Cowboys learned to read those small signs like words in a book. The sudden hush that meant a storm was coming, or the restless shifting of cattle before a cold snap. They knew the land in ways maps could never capture. Through smells carried on the wind, the crunch of gravel under hoof, and the color of a sunrise that hinted at rain. Yet, even in this raw closeness to nature, there was always the threat of the unexpected. A horse spooking at a rattlesnake could turn a quiet morning into chaos, sending men sprawling and supplies scattering. A hidden washout might swallow a whole steer before anyone could shout a warning. Each challenge was met with curses spat into the wind and quick hands that stitched the day back together. Somehow, through sheer stubbornness and silent prayers, they kept moving forward. Food on the trail was another battle. Beans cooked over open flames, sourdough biscuits charred on the outside and gooey inside, and salted pork so tough you'd think it came off a saddle rather than a pig. A good cook, the cookie, was a prized figure, half chef, half wizard, able to conjure something edible from the most pitiful pantry. A cowboy might grumble about burnt beans, but he'd fight tooth and nail to keep a good cook around. Bad food could turn even the toughest men into muttering ghosts, but a hot cup of coffee and a warm meal could revive spirits like nothing else. Despite the hard grind, there were flashes of odd tenderness. A cowboy slipping a sugar lump to his horse after a brutal climb, or someone patching a friend's coat with an awkward but earnest stitch. Sometimes they passed around old letters from home, each man handling the fragile pages like relics, words read and reread until they felt memorized. A line from a sister, a mother, or a girl waiting by some distant window could echo in a cowboy's head for weeks, replaying softly as he guided the herd beneath a moonlit sky. Evenings always held a certain hush, that slow settling of the land and the men. The sky turned to a deep violet sea, and fires flickered like scattered stars at ground level. Gear was checked again and again, boots relaced, hats cleaned of the day's dust. Each small ritual helped patch up the pieces of a man worn thin by the day. The more you repeated them, the more they felt like a prayer, silent promises that tomorrow, somehow, you'd do it all over again. Around the fire, some men sat hunched, silent and thoughtful, while others stretched out with easy smiles, swapping jokes too rough for daylight. The horses, tethered just beyond the glow, shifted and snorted softly, their outlines barely visible against the night's velvet curtain. It was in those moments, between spoonfuls of beans and the hiss of the coffee pot, that a cowboy felt most at home. Not in a house with walls and a roof, but in the endless, breathing sprawl of the open plains. So the next time you picture a cowboy, all swagger and spurs, remember this. Beneath the bravado, there was a quiet rhythm to their lives, a gentle heartbeat that matched the land itself. Each day was a lesson in patience, resilience, and the fierce, unspoken love for a world that offered both dust storms and stars in equal measure. Through all the long days and longer nights, one thing tied it all together: the code, an unwritten rulebook that hummed quietly beneath every shouted command and shared cup of coffee. It wasn't written down anywhere, yet every cowboy carried it in his bones as surely as he carried a lariat on his saddle horn. The code meant you looked after your horse before yourself, always. A horse wasn't just a tool. It was a lifeline, a partner that could save you from a charging bull or carry you to safety in a storm. So no matter how bone-tired a man was, he'd rub down his horse, check its hooves, and whisper a few soft words before thinking of his own supper. In that simple act was a kind of respect deeper than any handshake or contract. The code also meant sharing water without question. Out on the plains, water was life, rarer than silver and twice as precious. A canteen was passed without a word, a quiet understanding that tomorrow the tables might turn and you'd be the one with a tongue like sandpaper, waiting for relief. A man who refused to share water wouldn't last long among cowboys. He'd find himself alone faster than a tumbleweed in a windstorm. It meant stepping in during trouble, no matter how tired or scared you were. If a horse spooked and bolted, or a steer broke from the herd at a dead run, you didn't wait to see who else might help. You moved. No one kept score. Every rescue, every helping hand was simply part of the dance. They didn't call it bravery. They just called it doing what had to be done. And when a man fell, because eventually everyone did, the code said you got him back on his feet. A busted rib, a snake bite, a bruised spirit after a bad fall. No man was left to lick his wounds alone. Around the fire, a pot of strong coffee might appear in his hands, a blanket laid across his shoulders without a word. It wasn't softness, not exactly. It was survival, shaped by necessity and stitched together by quiet loyalty. These rules were never spoken aloud, but you saw them everywhere. In the way a cowboy would trade his last bit of tobacco for another man's spare bullet, or how two rivals might suddenly work together to wrestle a bull back into line. It was an invisible thread, holding each man steady even when everything else felt as wild and unpredictable as a summer storm. Beyond the code, the work itself held a poetry that only those who lived it could understand. There was a certain music to a well-thrown loop or the rhythm of hooves moving in sync across an endless pasture. Some nights, a cowboy might lie back in the grass, his hat tipped low, listening to the steady breathing of the herd and feeling, just for a moment, that he was part of something bigger than himself, bigger than any town, any badge, any dusty saloon fight. They might have looked like loners to the townsfolk, men who preferred their own company and the sound of wind over human chatter. But out there, on the range, each cowboy was part of an unspoken choir. Each whistle, each shout, each quiet whistle back from the horizon echoing in a shared, living language. They might have been scattered across miles of open land, but in their minds, they rode together, connected by that thin, bright line of loyalty. In the end, it wasn't the saloon brawls, the dancing, or even the wild stories that defined them. It was this quiet code, this iron thread of respect, care, and unwavering grit. A cowboy might not say much about honor or duty. He'd just tighten his cinch, glance at the horizon, and ride on. Because words blow away in the prairie wind, but actions leave tracks that last as long as the sun still rises over the open plains. If you followed a cowboy long enough, you'd start to notice the little things that kept him going, not just the big adventures or the campfire laughs. It was the small comforts hidden in the daily grind that kept the spirit alive, like tiny sparks in a dark canyon. Take the saddle, for example. It wasn't just a piece of equipment. It was home. Each man shaped his saddle to fit him perfectly, wearing it like a second skin. Every scratch and worn patch told a story. The sudden bolt of a green-broke horse, a hard tumble down a rocky slope, a moment of victory at a sudden steer catch. Some cowboys tied small tokens to the horn. A lucky rabbit's foot, a bit of ribbon from a county fair sweetheart, or a coin punched with a hole and strung on rawhide. They didn't talk about these charms much, but you could tell they mattered by the way they checked for them every morning, almost like counting prayers on a rosary. Boots carried their own silent sagas. Dust caked deep into the seams, heels worn down from days of nudging tired horses forward. Sometimes, late at night, a cowboy might pull off his boots and find new blisters blooming, or spots rubbed raw enough to make a grown man wince. Yet the next morning, he'd pull those boots right back on, grumbling and groaning, because that was just the way of it. No one was going to carry you, and no cowboy would ever ask to be carried. Bandanas, bright splashes of color in a world of brown and gray, did more than keep the dust out of mouths. They were used to mop sweat, as emergency bandages, for wiping down a horse's face after a hard ride, or even to wave as a signal across the prairie. A cowboy's bandana was as personal as a fingerprint, a simple cloth soaked in sun, sweat, and stories. Then there were the small, stolen moments of rest. Leaning against a fence post at midday, chewing on a straw and watching clouds shift into shapes only he could see. Or sitting cross-legged by a creek, trousers rolled to the knee, letting cold water numb his trail-worn feet. Sometimes a cowboy would spend a quiet hour oiling his saddle or mending a frayed rope, his mind drifting far away, lost somewhere between memories and dreams. Some kept journals, though they'd never admit it to the others. Tiny books, pages yellowed and corners curled, filled with scribbles about a runaway steer, a moonlit river crossing, or the way a girl's hair looked the last time he saw her on the depot platform. Those words weren't for show. They were anchors, proof that they had been somewhere, felt something mattered beyond the next bend in the trail. There was also a sort of quiet rivalry that hummed beneath the surface, pushing each man to be a little faster, a little tougher, a little more daring. A cowboy might bet a week's pay he could stay on the wildest bronco longer than anyone else, or that he could rope a runaway calf in fewer throws. But beneath that swagger was always respect. A man might boast all evening by the fire, but come sunrise, he'd still help his rival cinch up a tricky saddle or share the last of his tobacco without a second thought. And finally, there was the companionship of animals. Dogs trailed behind the herd, smart and quick as shadows. They got scraps tossed from plates and a soft word now and then, a rare kindness in a life built on grit. Horses, meanwhile, became mirrors to their riders' souls. Skittish when a man was tense, calm when he found that hidden patience deep inside. Sometimes, late at night, a cowboy might rest his forehead against his horse's neck, breathing in that warm, grassy scent and feeling, for a moment, less alone in that great open world. In all these small gestures, the checked saddle charm, the swapped bandana, the journal hidden beneath a blanket roll, you could glimpse the true heart of a cowboy. A heart stitched together not just by bar fights and rodeos, but by silent kindnesses, half-remembered songs, and the simple hope that tomorrow's sunrise might be just a little gentler than today's. As the miles kept slipping under hoof and the sunsets painted the sky in impossible colors, a cowboy learned to measure time in ways no clock could capture. Days weren't marked by hours but by the feel of the saddle beneath him, the sting of the wind on his cheeks, and the warmth of the sun rising at his back. Time bent and twisted, stretched thin during endless rides and then snapped shut during fleeting moments of rest. Each trail had its own rhythm, and every cowboy learned to listen. The crunch of gravel under a horse's shoes, the sigh of cattle settling into evening, the sudden hush that meant danger was close. These sounds wove into an unspoken symphony that carried them forward day after dusty day. The work never really ended. Even when the herd stopped for the night, minds stayed restless. Men would lie awake staring at stars so bright they seemed to pulse with secrets. Their thoughts drifted far from the plains, to warm kitchens, the smell of rain on a tin roof, a mother's soft singing echoing through memory. Sometimes a man would get up and add another log to the fire, or walk to the edge of camp and gaze into the black beyond, as if expecting an answer to rise from the dark. Letters from home were rare treasures. A single sheet of paper could turn a cowboy's entire world inside out. A sister announcing a new baby, a mother worrying over weather, a girl promising to wait, though everyone knew how long promises lasted when the trains came through. Those folded pages were read and reread until they nearly fell apart, each word etched deeper than any scar. Sometimes a man would tuck a letter into his shirt pocket, close to his heart, and reach for it without even realizing when the nights grew especially lonesome. When a cowboy got sick or injured, there was no fancy doctor waiting in a white coat. Instead, there was whiskey, bandanas, and the rough but steady hands of another cowboy doing his best to patch things up. A broken arm meant learning to ride one-handed or finding clever ways to tie knots with your teeth. A fever meant sweating it out wrapped in every spare blanket, watched over by a buddy who'd pretend he wasn't worried, even as he checked your forehead every hour. Survival wasn't about brute strength alone. It was about relying on each other when the prairie decided to show its teeth. When a cowboy passed on, and they did more often than anyone liked to admit, there wasn't much ceremony. A shallow grave, a hat placed gently on the mound, maybe a shared swig of whiskey passed around the circle. Then, with a final look at the horizon, the herd moved on. But for weeks afterward, a rider might feel the ghost of his lost friend in every echoing hoofbeat, or catch his name slipping out in a half-formed curse at a stray calf. Yet even with death riding quietly alongside them, cowboys found ways to celebrate life. A shared sunrise after a storm felt like a church bell ringing in the soul. The first green sprout after a long drought was a sign worth toasting with whatever was left in a battered flask. They learned to find joy in small mercies. A horse that didn't shy from thunder, a day without any runaways, the sweet surprise of wild berries found along a creek bed. This life, rough, raw, and restless, was more than just a job. It was a full-bodied testament to stubborn hope and fierce independence. Beneath every layer of dust and behind every squint against the sun, there pulsed a deep, unspoken promise that no matter how many miles lay ahead or how many storms gathered on the horizon, they would keep riding. Always forward, always chasing that whisper of freedom hidden somewhere just beyond the next ridge. So when the fire crackled low and the stars blinked down like watchful eyes, a cowboy might tip his hat back, take a deep breath, and let the weight of the day settle into his bones. Tomorrow, the same grind awaited, the same blisters, the same endless sky. But tonight, in that narrow window between exhaustion and dreams, he was simply a man under the heavens, alive and unbroken, savoring one more quiet victory over the wild world. When a cowboy finished his last sip of whiskey or scraped the final crumb when it came to food and drink on the open range, cowboys learned early that survival wasn't about gourmet flavors but about keeping going. Meals were as rough and honest as the men themselves, built on practicality and whatever supplies the chuck wagon could haul. Beans were the undisputed kings of the trail. They were cheap, dried, easy to carry, and nearly impossible to ruin, though many a cook managed to try. After a long day in the saddle, there was something comforting in the slow bubbling of a bean pot over the fire, even if it wasn't exactly a feast for the senses. Cowboys would joke that they'd eaten so many beans they were more bean than man. In truth, these humble legumes became an almost sacred centerpiece around which evening tales and ribbing unfolded. Salt pork was the protein of choice, salty, fatty, and tough enough to survive weeks on the trail. It was often boiled or fried up in slices, and while it wouldn't win any prizes for tenderness, it delivered the needed calories for another brutal day. Many cowboys gnawed at it like a dog with an old bone, grateful simply to have something that resembled meat. Bread, or more accurately, sourdough biscuits or flapjacks, were a rare treat when flour supplies allowed. The sourdough starter was a prized possession, guarded and fed like a pet. In a landscape where fresh yeast was unheard of, a lively starter meant fluffy biscuits that felt like a miracle after days of jerky and hardtack. Coffee, however, was the real heartbeat of a cowboy's diet. Strong enough to dissolve spoons, it was boiled right in the pot, grounds and all. Sometimes eggshells were tossed in to settle the floating grit, though that was more rumor than reliable method. There was an unspoken ritual in the first cup at dawn. A moment of silence, a slow sip, the world waking up one heartbeat at a time. It wasn't just about the caffeine. It was about comfort, warmth, and the thin thread of civilization that stretched back to some kitchen far away. When a cowboy could get his hands on fresh meat, usually during a roundup or if a steer went lame, it was a real event. Steaks seared on a hot iron skillet, fat crackling into the fire, the scent drifting across the prairie like a promise. Butchering was quick and practical. No fancy cuts, no delicate fillets, just slabs of beef slapped on the coals. If they were lucky, there might be organ meats too, often shared around with surprising reverence. Drinking, of course, took its own place in cowboy lore. On the range, liquor was scarce, often reserved for medicine or stashed away jealously. But when they rode into town after months of abstinence, whiskey flowed like a river. Punchers usually preferred bourbon whiskey, taken straight, in big tin cups. Fancy mixed drinks? Those were for city folks. A cowboy's courtesy demanded that when he drank, he filled his cup to the brim, using his gun hand, a quiet gesture of pride and trust. It was more than just a drink. It was a declaration that tonight, at least, he was alive and undefeated. Snacks on the trail were grim and practical. Hardtack that could break your teeth, jerky tougher than saddle leather, dried apples if luck was on your side. Fresh produce was a myth. Vegetables grew in cans, if they showed up at all. Milk, only in condensed form. Eggs, imported and known as States eggs, a rare luxury. The idea of a garden was laughable. Who had time or water for tomatoes when cattle needed driving and storms were forever on the horizon? Despite this meager diet, mealtimes on the trail were small celebrations. After the sun went down and the air cooled, cowboys gathered near the chuck wagon. They swapped lies and laughter, found warmth in bitter coffee and charred bacon, and let the day's aches melt away under a sky spattered with stars. Every bite, every sip, no matter how rough, stitched them closer together in that strange, endless brotherhood of the open range. It's funny to think how a steaming pot of beans or a battered coffee pot could become almost holy out there. But when your days were measured in dust storms and endless cattle balls, those simple comforts felt like small miracles dropped straight from the heavens. The chuck wagon, that clattering kitchen on wheels, was the heart and soul of any long drive. It carried flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, sugar when it could be spared, and the occasional surprise, maybe a jar of molasses or a few precious cans of peaches. These were rationed like gold dust, and a single spoonful of something sweet could hush an entire camp into blissful silence. The cook, often called Cookie or Old Woman, regardless of his age or toughness, held a power few outsiders understood. He might be cranky as a cornered bobcat, but no cowboy dared cross him. A good cook kept spirits high, even when the weather turned ugly and the herd refused to settle. Cookie's sharp tongue was feared almost as much as his heavy ladle, and his jokes, usually about a cowboy's table manners or smell, became part of the night's entertainment. When Cookie yelled, "Come and get it," there was no ceremony. Men lined up, plates and cups in hand, ready for whatever mystery stew or scorched biscuit lay waiting. Meals were usually eaten perched on logs or cross-legged in the dust, plates balanced on knees. Seconds? Only if you were quick and Cookie felt generous. If you showed up late, you might find nothing but a few cold beans stuck to the pot, a harsh lesson you wouldn't soon forget. The etiquette around food was its own quiet dance. No one took more than his share, and everyone respected the cook's authority like gospel. No cowboy dared complain too loudly about a burnt flapjack or weak coffee, unless he wanted to find his next plate served with an extra helping of ridicule. Food fights were rare, but if a man started tossing biscuits at his bunkmate, he'd likely end up scrubbing pans for the next week. Cowboys also had a curious fondness for sweets. If someone brought candy or a bit of cake from town, it disappeared faster than water on a hot skillet. Molasses cookies, if Cookie felt ambitious, became legends. Even rough old trail bosses, who could cuss the paint off a fence, softened up at the sight of a sugary treat. In town, after weeks or even months on the trail, cowboys swarmed toward saloons and restaurants like bees to clover. They ordered steak dinners, pies piled high with crust, and eggs cooked every possible way. They savored each bite like it might vanish at any second. But even after gorging on real meals, many still craved that black, gritty coffee that tasted like camp smoke and carried whispers of 1,000 sunrises on the open plain. Whiskey nights were their own beast entirely. Out on the trail, a flask might appear for a birthday, after a near miss with a stampede, or to toast a fallen friend. In town, all bets were off. A cowboy might down half a bottle, slap a buddy on the back hard enough to knock him into a piano, and dance a jig with whoever would join. The next morning always came with a price. Heads pounding, stomachs rebelling, voices hoarse from shouting old songs into the moonlight. Still, ask any cowboy, and he'd say it was worth every dizzy minute. The reality of trail food and town feasts painted two sides of the same life. One side demanded grit, chewing on jerky so tough it could patch a boot, sipping coffee that doubled as paint thinner, and savoring dry biscuits like they were slices of cake. The other side, the brief flashes in town, reminded them of softness, of what waited beyond the horizon if they were lucky enough to make it back. In the end, every meal, no matter how plain or burned, was another thread in the long, rough fabric of cowboy life. It wasn't about flavor or presentation. It was about survival, shared jokes, and the unspoken comfort of knowing that tomorrow, they'd all be back in the saddle together, chasing sunrises and finding warmth in whatever rough pot Cookie dared to boil next. By the time a cowboy finished his last bite and tipped back the dregs of his tin cup, the meal became more than just a moment to fill his stomach. It turned into a kind of ritual, a small anchor in a life that otherwise drifted like tumbleweed in the wind. There was a certain poetry to the way meals marked the day. At dawn, the smell of scorched coffee and sizzling salt pork signaled the start of another gamble against the wide-open world. Midday, if there was time, brought a cold bite of hardtack or jerky under the thin shadow of a mesquite tree. And by night, the crackle of the fire and the heavy scent of beans rolling in thick, smoky waves promised a few fleeting hours of warmth and human chatter before sleep claimed the camp. Most cowboys learned early to accept whatever found its way into their bowl. Complaint was useless and usually met with a dry laugh or a wooden spoon aimed at your hat. You took what was handed to you, gave a quick thanks to Cookie, if you knew what was good for you, and scraped the last bean from the bottom like it was a treasure. They called it eating high on the hog when the food was halfway decent, though most days they were lucky if it felt like eating anywhere near the hog at all. During town visits, though, it was a different world entirely. Some cowboys would save up their meager wages for one grand blowout meal. Steak thick as a saddle blanket, eggs piled in buttery stacks, a fresh loaf of bread that didn't taste like dust and ashes. A piece of pie could bring a man close to tears, especially if it was filled with berries or apples. In those first bites, memories of home kitchens and simpler days would come flooding back so strong it might hush even the rowdiest table. In saloons, food was less about sustenance and more about showing off. Ordering the best cuts of beef, slices of ham glistening under lamplight, oysters if they were feeling particularly flush and adventurous. The bravado of town life gave way to a kind of temporary gentleness when faced with real, fresh-cooked food. Forks clinked against plates, conversation softened, and even the loudest cowboy chewed slowly, savoring every stolen second of softness. But back on the trail, romance evaporated faster than spit on a skillet. Sometimes, a meal was just whatever you could stuff in your mouth before a storm rolled over the plains or a runaway steer demanded a midnight chase. Cold beans in the rain, a chunk of jerky in the saddle at dawn. These were as common as the prairie wind. Yet, in these roughest meals, there was a thread of stubborn joy. A shared hunk of jerky between two riders felt like a handshake sealed by dust and sweat. A cold biscuit tossed across a fire circle turned into a playful challenge, a reminder that no matter how hard the day had been, they could still share a laugh. Oddly enough, many cowboys developed a kind of pride in their ability to stomach the worst. Bragging rights belonged to the man who could eat the toughest salt pork without flinching or gulp the harshest coffee without a grimace. Food was another measure of toughness, another badge sewn into that invisible uniform of grit and resilience. There were also the rare moments when a cowboy got creative. Someone might sneak wild onions into the beans or barter with a passing settler for a jar of honey to drizzle on biscuits. A few would boast about their ability to cook fancy, flipping flapjacks in the skillet or making gravy thick enough to stand a spoon upright. These culinary experiments sometimes ended in triumph, and other times in curses echoing across the prairie when an entire pot of beans turned to black crust. At the end of it all, food was a reflection of the cowboy's life itself. Rough, simple, unpredictable, but always shared. Every burnt flapjack and sour cup of coffee bound them tighter than any rope ever could. So as the stars winked above and the fire cracked low, a cowboy might lean back, pat his belly, and let out a long, satisfied sigh, knowing that come sunrise, he'd do it all over again, bite by dusty, beautiful bite. Some cowboys claimed they could tell what kind of day it would be just by the first whiff rising off the morning pot of coffee. If it smelled strong enough to wake the dead, they figured they'd get through the day without a hitch. But if it was watery or burned, well, they knew to brace for runaway cattle, busted stirrups, or sudden prairie squalls. Breakfast set the tone for every mile that followed. It was usually quick and rough. Leftover beans reheated, a chunk of dry biscuit, maybe a sliver of bacon if they were lucky. No one lingered over their plate. The cattle didn't wait for anyone, and the horizon was always calling. Some cowboys liked to talk big about the breakfast spreads they'd enjoy when they finally settled down. Eggs fried sunny side up, sweet rolls dripping with honey, strong coffee that didn't taste like river mud. But until that day, they'd scrape every last crumb from their plate in the half-dark, shoulders hunched against the morning chill. On the trail, food wasn't just a physical need, it was a mental anchor. A cowboy might count the hours to dinner not because of hunger alone, but because that meal meant a pause. A few moments to lean back, chew slowly, and let tired muscles ease under the quiet sky. After days of battling dust devils and stubborn longhorns, Even a scorched flapjack could feel like a royal feast. Then there was the ritual of cleaning up, or as close to it as the plains allowed. Plates were wiped clean with scraps of biscuit, cups rinsed with the last dregs of coffee. Soap was rare and water even rarer, so the idea of sanitary living stayed firmly in the world of city folks. Some cowboys claimed the dust and grit gave meals an extra kick, though you'd have to wonder if they really believed it or just liked the sound of it around the fire. In town, it was another story. Suddenly, the same men who'd wolfed down beans with dirt-crusted hands would turn into part-time gourmets. They'd order steaks cooked medium rare or as close as the cook could manage. Plates of eggs piled so high they looked like snowy mountains, and pies so sweet they could make a man forget a month of trail dust in one bite. If a cowboy had a few extra coins jingling in his pocket, he'd spring for a bottle of good whiskey or maybe even a round of drinks for the whole saloon. Food became celebration, proof that they'd made it through another drive alive, and that for a few bright hours they could live like kings. Desserts in town held a special magic. Fresh berry pies, sugar cookies, sweet custards, they were worth more than gold. A man might talk all night about the slice of pie he had 3 towns back, his voice softening like he was recalling an old flame. Sweets reconnected them to gentler memories. Mothers baking in warm kitchens, childhood fairs with sticky candy apples, or church picnics under oak trees. Drinks, though, remained the true social glue. Whiskey, in particular, was more than just a liquid, it was a ceremony. Passed hand to hand, it loosened tongues, washed away the day's aches, and turned strangers into brothers, at least until the next bar fight. Rumors even told of some cowboys who carried a secret stash, hidden away in saddlebags for only the worst of days. One swig could make the open prairie feel less endless, the stars a little closer, the cold night air a little softer against sunburned skin. Despite all the rough edges, meals wove a thread of humanity through the brutal rhythm of cowboy life. They reminded each man that he was more than just a moving silhouette on the horizon. He was a living, breathing soul, hungry not just for food but for warmth, companionship, and those rare sweet moments that tasted like home. When the plates were emptied and the fire burned low, you might catch a cowboy leaning back, a faraway look softening the lines carved into his face. Maybe he was dreaming of a kitchen light glowing in a distant window or the laughter of a sister stirring pie dough in a long-forgotten summer. In that quiet, he wasn't just a rider or a herder. He was a man, heart beating steady beneath the stars, savoring every scrap of sweetness the world had to offer before the next day's dust swallowed him whole. When the last crumbs had vanished and the coffee pot gave its final sputtering sigh, the cowboys' evening turned toward quieter comforts. With bellies full, or at least not growling anymore, they shifted closer to the fire, legs stretched, hats tipped low, shoulders easing down from the day's invisible weight. Some might pull a piece of jerky from a pocket, gnawing absent-mindedly as they listened to the fire pop and crack. Others might pass around a small tin of tobacco, sharing slow, careful rolls of cigarettes. The glowing tips bobbed in the dark like tiny fireflies, each puff an unspoken sigh echoing into the endless night. For a cowboy, these after-supper moments were like a soft blanket pulled over the day. They traded stories, some true, most stretched to the edge of believability. Tales of phantom herds glowing under moonlight, or of the time someone roped a steer while dangling from a tree limb, or the mythical cook who could bake a pie so good it made a sheriff forget a warrant. Laughter rolled around the circle, warm as the coffee mugs now lying empty in the dirt. Sometimes, someone would find a harmonica or a battered fiddle, notes spilling into the night air like scattered stars. A cowboy's voice might rise above it all, low and rough, carrying a lonesome tune across the prairie. The songs were rarely cheerful, more often old laments of lost love or longing for a distant home. Yet those sorrowful chords felt comforting, a reminder that even the toughest riders carried soft spots beneath their dusty hides. As the music drifted and the stories tangled together like drifting smoke, Cookie would wander around, poking the coals, checking his pans. He knew that even the best meals left men hungry for something deeper. A hint of warmth, a memory of sweetness, a moment where the world stopped feeling so sharp and endless. In those final minutes before turning in, some cowboys might cradle a tin cup, swirling the last drops of whiskey like a priest with incense. A few might murmur about tomorrow, whether a storm was rolling in, if the herd would hold steady, or what the next town's cook might be able to rustle up. But most stayed silent, eyes fixed on the dark beyond the firelight, listening to the chorus of coyotes tuning up in the distance. It wasn't all deep and dreamy, of course. A sudden snore would erupt, followed by a boot tossed in the direction of the offender. Two fellas might wrestle playfully over the last piece of biscuit. Someone might boast that he could eat another whole pot of beans if only Cookie would make it, drawing groans and laughter from the rest. These rough edges kept them human, kept the nights from growing too heavy. As each man finally unrolled his blanket or tucked into his saddle for a pillow, the night swallowed their words. The fire burned down to gentle embers, casting sleepy shadows on faces lined by wind and sun. The scent of charred bacon still clung faintly to their clothes, mixing with the dust and sweat of another day hard won. And under the dome of that endless, glittering sky, every cowboy carried his own quiet gratitude for the simple blessing of a warm meal, a hot cup, and the small, stubborn brotherhood that held them together in the dark. Tomorrow, they'd rise again before the dawn, reach for another chipped tin plate, and start the whole dusty dance anew. But tonight, with bellies filled and spirits briefly eased, they could rest, just men under the stars, free for a few sweet, fleeting hours before the trail claimed them again. When a cowboy finished his last sip of whiskey or scraped the final crumb from his plate, the night wasn't quite done with him yet. Beyond all the cards, songs, and muddy coffee, there was an invisible world that pulsed beneath their boots, a world of quiet rituals and stubborn superstitions. Out on the plains, luck wasn't just a word. It was a living thing, something you had to feed and coax like a skittish horse. Every cowboy had his own set of rules for keeping fortune on his side. One of the most sacred: never ever lay your hat on a bed. They said it called death into camp, like a silent invitation to the reaper. A hat belonged on a peg, a saddle horn, or even the dusty ground. Anywhere but that blanket roll where a man laid his weary head. If someone forgot and tossed their hat onto a bunk, you'd see every other cowboy in the tent stiffen, eyes flicking toward the doorway as if they half expected a ghost to drift through. Mirrors were another source of trouble. A broken mirror meant 7 years of bad luck in town, but out on the prairie it was worse, a sign you might not come home at all. Mirrors were rare enough anyway, usually just a small shard kept tucked in a saddlebag for shaving or checking a sunburnt nose. So when one cracked, it wasn't just an annoyance. It was a dark omen that settled like a shadow over the camp. Some cowboys carried tiny charms in their pockets. A silver coin, a bit of knotted string, a dried snake rattle. Others trusted in quiet habits, tying a certain knot 3 times before a big cattle drive, spitting over their left shoulder before mounting up, or knocking on wood after a lucky day. These small gestures weren't shared with outsiders. They were private deals with the universe, little whispered pacts to keep death and disaster at bay. Animals played a part too. Owls calling near camp were a sure sign of coming trouble, and a rattlesnake spotted at dawn meant someone was bound to get hurt before the sun set again. On the flip side, seeing a lone coyote slinking through the grass might be read as a blessing, proof that a spirit guide was watching over the herd. Some men swore by crows as messengers, reading their calls the way a gambler reads the shuffle of cards. Before big cattle drives or when taking on a dangerous new bronco, cowboys might hold private ceremonies. A few muttered a prayer, not the polished Sunday kind, but raw words spat into the wind, half challenge, half plea. Others would rub their saddle horn or tap a special token hidden under their shirt. Even the toughest, most iron-hearted rider had some secret ritual, a tiny tether to something bigger than dust and muscle. There were communal beliefs too. Before leaving camp, it was common to ride a slow circle around the herd, almost like drawing a protective line in the dirt. At new campsites, some cowboys scattered salt or burned sagebrush to keep evil spirits from sneaking into dreams. They might laugh about it in the daylight, but when stars crowded the sky and the wind howled like a mourning widow, those superstitions felt as real as the cold iron of a six-shooter. When a new herd arrived or a fresh horse was introduced, rituals flowed naturally. Cowboys might pat the horse's forehead, whispering a few low words, or tie a scrap of red cloth to its mane for luck. A greenhorn ignoring these traditions would earn a hard glare, or worse, an empty saddle come sunrise. In the end, these beliefs weren't just about luck. They were about control in a world that offered precious little of it. Between stampedes, lightning storms, and sudden fevers, the line between life and death could vanish quicker than a prairie fire. So they built small rituals, stacked fragile shields against the unknown, and found comfort in the repetition of old gestures. As the fire crackled low and coyotes cried in the distance, a cowboy might turn a small token over in his hand, tracing it like a lifeline. He'd tip his hat to the moon, spit into the dust, and slide under his blanket with a final nod to the spirits drifting in the dark. Tomorrow would come, whether fortune favored him or not, but tonight, at least, he'd done his part to keep the shadows at bay. Some superstitions wrapped themselves so tightly into daily life that they stopped feeling like superstition at all. They became as natural as tightening a cinch or spitting dust out of your teeth after a long ride. Take the rule about starting a ride on the right foot. Many cowboys believe that if you mounted your horse leading with the left foot first, you'd invite mishaps all day. A thrown shoe, a busted rope, a sudden buck that sent you flying. So even when muscles were stiff from cold mornings or backs ached from a week's worth of rough rides, you'd see cowboys pause, shift their weight, and make sure that right foot hit the stirrup first. No one questioned it. You just did it because somewhere deep down you felt the prairie was always watching, always listening for small slips. There were rules for knives too. Handing a knife directly to another man was a guaranteed way to cut your friendship clean through. Instead, you'd set it down on a log or rock and let him pick it up himself. Cowboys didn't need to quote scripture about it. They just knew. Some took it further, refusing to cut bread with a borrowed knife or to eat from a blade without first wiping it 3 times. A tiny, silent ritual that looked like nothing but carried deep meaning. Weather signs were woven with superstition and survival alike. A red sky at morning wasn't just pretty. It was a grim warning of storms brewing on the horizon. Cattle acted jumpy, better tie things down and keep the rifle close. A ring around the moon, they'd whisper about bad luck riding in on the wind. These weren't just folk tales. They were defense mechanisms against a land that loved to throw curveballs with no warning at all. Fire itself had its own language of luck and caution. A fire that popped too loud was said to be announcing unexpected visitors or bad news galloping your way. If a log cracked sharp enough to echo, some cowboys would go quiet, eyes fixed on the dark edges beyond the circle of flame. Others would mutter charms, stir the embers, or toss in a pinch of salt. It was a fragile fortress, that ring of firelight, a place where you could keep the dark at arm's length, if only for a few hours. Horses, of course, had their own share of quiet blessings and warnings. If a horse refused water at dawn, you might hear a cowboy mutter that trouble was close. A sudden snort or refusal to step forward on a trail could turn into a full detour, no matter how tight the schedule. They believed their mounts saw things men couldn't, spirits drifting low in the sagebrush, echoes of long-gone riders whispering through the canyons. Trusting a horse's instincts wasn't just wise, it was survival. A cowboy would rather appear foolish than ignore a snort that might mean the difference between returning home or being buried in the dust. New riders, green as spring grass, often scoffed at these habits, until they found themselves alone in a sudden thunderstorm, or lost in a swirl of prairie fog so thick it swallowed the world whole. After that, they'd pick up charms, start knocking on wood, and eye their hats with newfound respect. It didn't take many close calls to teach a man that a little caution was better than another mark on the trail where a rider had vanished. In the hush between stories and songs, when the fire burned low and the stars crowded closer overhead, you'd sometimes see a cowboy trace a small sign on his saddle horn or murmur a few words into the dark. It looked like he was talking to the moon, maybe confessing old sins or promising to play it safe tomorrow. In reality, he was just trying to make peace with a world too big and wild to ever truly tame. By the time boots were pulled off and heads dropped onto saddles for pillows, each man had his own private shield stitched together from half-whispered prayers and unbreakable habits. Those small defenses let them drift into sleep, knowing they'd done their best to charm away whatever ghosts and mischief might be lurking out beyond the last glow of the coals. Sometimes a cowboy's superstitions drifted beyond pure survival and into the gentle, almost poetic realm of old beliefs handed down from mothers, neighbors, and half-remembered church sermons. A piece of string tied around a wrist to ward off fever. A small pouch of tobacco or sage pinned inside a vest to keep away the bad wind. Some wore tiny beads or carved tokens around their necks, each one humming with silent promises of protection when the prairie turned mean. There was an unwritten rule about whistling after dark. Whistling was said to call in spirits, lost riders, lonesome ghosts still drifting along old cattle trails, or worse, something no one dared name out loud. A cowboy might hum a tune or even sing low, but you'd rarely hear a true whistle after the fire dimmed. If someone forgot and let one slip, you'd see quick glances traded, a boot shuffle, maybe someone tossing another log on the fire as if to push the darkness back a few feet more. Even practical tools carried secret meanings. A broken spur wasn't just a busted piece of gear. It foretold a fight, a lost wager, or an accident waiting to pounce. If a lariat snapped during a catch, it meant you'd lose something dear before long. Some cowboys kept spare ropes tucked away not just for emergencies, but as a quiet guard against bad omens. They'd wrap their ropes carefully each night, as though tucking in a restless child, hoping to coax them into good behavior come morning. Birds, too, played a role in cowboy folklore. A lone hawk circling high was a sign of coming luck, or a visitor on the horizon. 3 crows perched together on a fence might make even the toughest man hesitate before saddling up. An owl hooting close to camp could set nerves twitching for hours, every little rustle suddenly sounding like an ambush or an incoming storm. When herds were restless, some cowboys blamed it on unseen spirits riding through the cattle at night. They'd tell stories of phantom riders, figures seen only from the corner of an eye, shadows weaving between the longhorns. A few swore they heard voices calling from beyond the herd, soft as wind, whispering names only they knew. After nights like that, even the bravest men might wake up to find their hair damp with sweat, hands curled tight around a knife or a rosary tucked beneath their blankets. Cowboys often carried tokens from home, simple objects transformed into talismans by memory and distance. A strip of lace from a sister's wedding dress, a bent horseshoe nail found in a childhood barn, a piece of quilt fabric folded so many times it felt like paper. These scraps of home offered invisible armor, each one a gentle reminder that somewhere beyond the endless plains, Someone still waited. Someone still prayed they'd return in one piece. It wasn't just about warding off death. It was about holding on to tiny sparks of warmth in a life otherwise ruled by wind, dust, and the weight of long, lonesome miles. These small rituals stitched meaning into their days, turning a bleak landscape into something a little less empty. When sunrise finally crept up and pale light slipped over the horizon like a shy guest, the cowboys' world would shift again. They'd rise, shake out their blankets, and pack away their charms and whispered fears along with their coffee cups. Yet even as they saddled up and tipped their hats to the rising sun, those quiet beliefs rode along in every heartbeat, every cautious glance at the sky, every careful knot tied in a lariat. By the time they swung into the saddle and turned to face another day of dust and open sky, the unseen world of spirits, omens, and old superstitions might slip out of sight. But deep down, under the leather and the grit, each cowboy carried a fragile faith in the unseen, a secret promise to whatever gods or ghosts might be listening, that he'd play fair if only they'd let him ride another day. Underneath all the dust and hard riding, these beliefs acted like small, invisible stitches, holding the cowboy's soul together. They weren't about fear alone, they were about connection. To the land, to each other, and to something deeper they might not even name out loud. Some men marked the passing of seasons not with calendars or clocks, but by the stories they swapped around the fire. A new star in the sky meant a new chance, a second try at luck gone sour. A sudden wind shift at night might carry a message from an old friend long gone, a whisper across the plains that made a man straighten his spine and tip his hat to the dark. You might see a cowboy pause before crossing a river, leaning forward in the saddle, almost as if listening. He might close his eyes and mutter a quick phrase into the water, a kind of offering to the spirits said to live in deep, hidden pools. These weren't grand ceremonies. They were quick, private moments that passed as swiftly as a prairie breeze. Before big cattle drives, it wasn't uncommon for a cowboy to sprinkle a pinch of tobacco onto the ground, a gift to the earth, a nod to unseen forces keeping watch over the trail ahead. If he felt especially anxious, he might bury a small object under a favorite mesquite tree. A button, a coin, a scrap of cloth, something to tie a bit of his spirit to safer ground while he was gone. When storms cracked open the night, lightning clawing at the hills and thunder shaking the very marrow in their bones, cowboys leaned into old habits even harder. They'd whisper prayers into their palms or press a lucky charm tight against their chest. A few would sing low to their horses, voices nearly lost to the roar. These small songs felt like lanterns in the storm, fragile but stubborn, flickering lights to guide them through the worst of it. Superstitions also showed up in how they welcomed newcomers. A greenhorn who ignored the quiet rules, riding off before a proper circle blessing, mocking a charm or whistling after dark, found himself at the edge of the group in more ways than one. Not because they disliked him, but because they feared his recklessness might draw trouble down on them all. Out there, one man's bad luck had a way of spilling over onto every saddle in the line. Some cowboys even believed you should never talk about a good day before sundown. Praising fair weather or a smooth drive too early was seen as tempting fate. They'd grin and wave away compliments with a muttered, "Day ain't over yet," or just tip their hat and move along. Better to stay humble than to invite the prairie to teach you humility the hard way. When a cowboy did fall, whether to a horse's kick, a stray horn, or a fever that wouldn't break, the quiet rituals turned solemn. A hat laid on the chest, a simple marker built from gathered stones, and maybe a soft verse spoken into the wind. Then the herd moved on, each rider carrying a piece of that lost spirit stitched into his own small collection of charms and silent promises. At night, when the world shrank to the glow of the campfire and the soft clatter of coffee cups, you might catch a cowboy tracing patterns in the dust with a fingertip. Simple shapes, spirals, or maybe a sign only he understood. Sometimes he'd stop mid-sentence, eyes drifting to the stars, as though waiting for a sign in their slow, steady dance. In those spaces between words and sparks, he made his peace with the land's vast, untamed heart, and with his own restless spirit, forever riding the thin line between luck and loss. By the time a cowboy settled under his blanket roll for the night, the prairie felt like a giant breathing creature all around him, silent, watchful, full of old secrets. As the fire flickered down to a red glow, you could almost feel the invisible world pressing closer, a reminder that the line between the living and the unknown was as thin as a worn saddle strap. Some cowboys believed that dreams were doorways, messages carried on moonlight. They might wake with a start, heart pounding from some phantom chase or a long-lost voice calling from the darkness. A man might sit up, rub his face, and mutter a promise to the stars, vowing to ride safer, to watch the herd closer, or to write home before winter came. These midnight bargains floated off into the wind, but somehow they stitched themselves into the dawn that followed. Mornings after such dreams felt heavy and quiet. Cowboys moved slower, eyes turned inward as they saddled up. One might finger a small charm hanging from his neck before tucking it under his shirt. Another might slip a stone from his pocket, roll it in his palm like a prayer bead, and place it carefully back. The coffee tasted a little more bitter on those days, and even Cookie kept his jokes soft, as if not to scare away any fragile bits of luck still hanging around camp. During long rides, these private superstitions played out in small, unnoticed ways. A cowboy might avoid a particular trail he'd always felt held bad spirits. He might glance over his shoulder if a sudden breeze cut across his face, convinced it carried a warning. Tiny gestures. A finger tapped 3 times on the saddle horn, a quick spit into the dust before a difficult crossing. Each was like an extra layer of armor against a world that never played fair. New riders learned quickly, usually after a scare or a close call. A horse refusing to cross a stream, a rope slipping free at the worst possible moment, a sudden fever that knocked a man out for days. After that, they started carrying their own small tokens, started whispering their own hurried words to the morning wind. Cowboys didn't force these habits on each other. They didn't have to. The land itself taught the lessons, sharp and final. If a cowboy made it through a season without losing a horse or a friend, he'd sometimes leave a token behind when they moved camp. A carved stick, a bit of bone, or a twisted piece of wire. A quiet thank you to whatever spirits had kept watch. When another herd passed through that same ground months later, they might find these small offerings, half buried in dust, and tip their hats in silent respect. There was a kind of poetry in it all, an unspoken understanding that no matter how many miles they covered or how tough they talked in town, every man out there felt small beneath the stars. Even the fiercest bronc buster, the loudest saloon singer, each one carried that flicker of fear, that private plea to the moon to let them ride another day. As they drifted off to sleep each night, cowboys lay cradled by a sky so wide it could swallow any boast whole. They'd listen to the low hush of cattle breathing, the gentle creak of saddle leather shifting in the dark, and the far-off howl of a lone coyote threading through the sage. In that final drowsy moment before dreams took hold, they might feel the faint warmth of a charm against their chest, the weight of old stories anchoring them softly to the earth. By morning, the rituals would begin all over again. Hats set right, quick glances at the sky, a final spit to the side before swinging into the saddle. And as hooves thudded into the waking plains, each man carried his superstitions forward, fragile, stubborn shields against a land as wild and unknowable as the dreams that tugged at them in the dark.